Good evening, everyone. So wonderful to be here in Ottawa at the National Arts Centre for the fall lecture of the Public Policy Forum. I'd like to thank Ed and the Forum for bringing together these incredible thinkers and the most experienced doers in the field of Canada-US relations so close to the election. I can't think of a more important conversation for us to have. We're meeting here on the cusp of this election, and I'd like to do two things tonight. Explore some of the provocative ideas that Janice and Ed have put forward along with co-author Drew Fagan in their recent paper. And then on our next panel, pressure test some of these ideas with two former ambassadors to Canada who I know have a lot to say both about how to improve the relationship and what to expect from the next administration. So I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to just jump in. And Ed and Janice, the first thing that really struck me about Matter More, your paper, was how it basically threw out the window the mantra that we'd heard for so many years after President Barack Obama declined the Keystone XL pipeline, and then President Trump came in, had trade wars, renegotiating NAFTA. People said, we need to move away from this over-dependence on the American market, the American economy. We need to diversify our relationships. And I think we even renamed a cabinet minister as the Minister of Moving Away from America, something like that. But your paper, as I read it, is basically, if I could completely misappropriate a phrase, it basically says America first. You want to matter more. So can you convince the skeptics in the audience, like, A, don't we matter? And B, why do we need to double down on this particular relationship at this time?
You know, as we've changed, the world has changed too, Louisa. And I think that's a big part of this story. It's not a mantra that's been with us for 10 years. It's been with us since Pierre Elliott Trudeau talked about the third option. We have made an effort to diversify, and over those 65 years, or depending on how you count, a little less, our exports have gone. We've done very well. Our exports to the United States have gone from 75% to 78%. So we have 40 years of a track record of failing to diversify. So let's call it what it is, a mantra, rather than a reflection of what Canada's relationship has been. Now, why would we argue, and I can well imagine a scenario in Canada if one of the candidates wins, where it will be very, very difficult to say to Canadians, embed yourself with the United States, make yourself more important to the United States. I think it's all the more important to do so under those circumstances. What's changed? For the United States, many of the economic issues are now national security issues. And that is not going away, frankly. I think that's the rest of the decade. And our economy is completely intertwined with the United States. So we're not hearing, and this is not a function of Trump, this is just as much the case under the Biden administration as it is under the Trump administration. That's number one. Number two, when you look at the use of tariffs, that is not exclusively a Trump issue. It is a Biden issue. And nobody will get caught in the maelstrom of tariffs, and nobody is more vulnerable. Here's the best way I think I can make the argument. There is no country in the developed world that is as dependent on a single export market as Canada is on the United States. Not even Germany and the European Union. So we have to grow up.
Well, Ed, what is the evidence that we don't matter enough?
Well, let me just build on what Janice said and come back. You know, we did canvass the possibility of the question that you asked. Well, is there an alternative? What is the alternative? So a lot of people think the alternative is growing Canada's population big time and having a greater domestic GDP. Well, I don't think that's been going very well for the last year. So that doesn't seem like a very easy, viable alternative. we have tried as a country to diversify our trade over many years, and that's a good thing to diversify your trade. We have worked very hard to grow trade with China, and I recognize the relationship with China has certainly changed in the last several years markedly, but we have grown it a lot to the point now where our trade with China in a year is equal to our trade with the United States every 19 days. 19 days. And so we looked and we said, okay, there really isn't a realistic alternative. And then we went to a second point, which was that diversifying used to be an alternative, the broadening versus deepening. We said, they're very complementary concepts in a world where you do have the China problem, and you do have the Russia problem, and you do have the friends trying to figure out not being so dependent on those two countries. Then if you're selling gas, if the United States is selling gas to Europe, let's say, and we're selling gas to Asia, is that deepening or broadening? It's the same. It's if we develop critical minerals and people are less reliant on China or Russia for those, is that deepening or broadening? So we thought it's a false dichotomy in today's world.
All right. Well, for those people watching on CPAC tonight, I should say we have the audience today is full of policymakers and policy professionals here in Ottawa. So I want to ask the audience to raise your hand if you think that the Canadian relationship with the United States, that we should double down on it more. All right. How many of you think we should emphasize more diversifying away? All right. Okay. There's a few. Okay.
Just one more.
Okay. Another one over there. Okay. I'll say that the double down is winning in this room. So the second thing that really struck me about this paper is it's not exclusively a paper about foreign policy or trade. It actually argues for a number of changes to domestic policy to align it more with US interests in a very proactive way. And Ed, I want to start with you. One of the big planks of your paper is you argue for what you call an AutoPact 2.0, which is basically a sector-specific approach that you describe as a deeper arrangement than a trade agreement, which would consist of co-production, co-investment, and co-procurement. And you talk about areas such as energy and critical minerals. So I guess very briefly, what would this look like?
So we did want to get beyond the question of just a trade arrangement or a classic border type of discussion, and we said, okay, what is the equivalent today in some way that oil was in the 1989 Free Trade Agreement? We had a lot of oil. The United States had an energy security crisis, true crisis. Presidents were elected and unelected on matters of that sort. And so we looked around, what are the leverage points that those themselves punch above their weight? And two of the four were, critical minerals and energy still, even though shale oil has changed that equation, shale gas has changed that equation. And so what it looks like is not what can we trade, but what can we do together? How can we build together in the way we do in NORAD and the way we do in the AutoPact and the supply chains there? And critical minerals is something. China controls more than 80% of the critical mineral trade and processing in the world. That's twice what OPEC controlled of oil at the height. And so the Western countries, the friends, are going to have to get together and become less dependent. And Canada happens to be one of the great storehouses in the world of minerals. Our geology is excellent. Our geography maybe is even better. And so we said, critical minerals, we need to have I'm going to say North America approach. Somebody earlier in the day said to me, you shouldn't say it North America because we don't think Mexico fits in the way Mexico fit in. And Cliff's polling, shows that pretty starkly. And in energy, so critical minerals, we could do things together. And then we could do it with our allies in the world together. In energy, Canada and the United States together, to start with, pump more oil. I realize oil is, a very strong argument it's on the decline in the world. Nonetheless, we pump more oil together than, or the same amount of oil together as Russia and Saudi Arabia. You know, that's pretty extraordinary. We are together a superpower. We are together superpower in gas. Uranium, Canada has a lot of uranium. The United States is way too dependent on Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan for its uranium. It knows that. It's taken measures, you know, to try to reverse that, I think, by 2028. Canada is, you know, the ready answer to that. So a whole bunch of areas there where we can do things together. And I'd just say gas as a last one. You know, we face Asia, they face Atlantic. There is a Panama Canal, but it's not as in good shape as it once was. We can do to the world what we've done with ourselves, which is our only great success in climate emissions, in GHG emissions, is that we've switched from coal to gas. And why don't we do that out in the world?
This all feels like deja vu. I mean, I feel like we've had this conversation for so long, but the reality is building a mine, building a refinery, building a pipeline, these are things that successive governments have struggled to do. So how do we even begin to have this conversation if we can't permit, build, extract things here?
Totally.
Like,
I'll go to
how
Janice
do
in
you
one
get
second.
there?
I'd just say that deepen, the thing says deepen, broaden, and accelerate. We need to accelerate building things, getting things built. I mean, we cannot face the geopolitical crisis and other crises at the pace we're going.
So Louise, one of the things we were talking about today, and I'm sure there are people in the room who will be sympathetic, we don't have a sense of urgency in Canada that is appropriate to the way the world has changed in the last, certainly 5 years, but in the last decade.
Why do you think that is?
Well, we're blessed. We live next door to a friendly country, and our northern communities are you know, our friends, our deep friends on our northern border. We don't have the experience of worrying about national security in the way that most countries in the world do. We had 2 wars, but the muscle memory, World War I and World War II, is gone, frankly, in Canada.
Well, I want to get, because I know you have a proposal on security, but just one last point here on the Auto Pact 2.0. So as I was saying, we have an incredible audience of very experienced and knowledgeable people. And I was speaking with one of them in the reception before this panel, and he asked me not to say his name, so I won't, but he's a very erudite person, and he gave me a very technical term for his analysis of your paper, and it was quote unquote bananas. And his objection, one of his several objections, was that you're focused on sectoral agreements where, in his view, broader free trade agreements are the way to go because you don't give up your leverage, you're able to use different trade, you know, different concessions, et cetera. He thought it was bananas to exclude Mexico, which is so important to the United States. And his assessment was it would be a much better strategy to eliminate supply management, the digital services tax, and other irritants. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that. All right, Ed.
Maybe I can take that one.
Oh, you're going to take it? Okay.
And, you know, bananas is a great technical description, which I really appreciate. But in fact, if we look at where trade agreements have been going for the last 20 years, they're not broad free trade agreements. WTO is frankly broken. Global trade agreements are frozen. All we've had is regional agreements. That's where, and we're seeing regionalization right across the world, Louisa, in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, and Canada. This is our region. And we can argue about Mexico, but North America is frankly our region. We all know that regardless of who wins this election, there will be a very tough renegotiation of NAFTA 2 or COSMA or whatever you want to call it, which is going to begin in 2026. So why? It's not that we won't make an enormous effort, and we will, and we need to get ready, and we need to get prepared, frankly, right now. But there's a broader point here. If you build institutional partnerships, and that's what the Auto Pact did, if you institutionalize them, you think about what the Auto Pact did, transformed our economy. A product in any car, you know, cars are, frankly, computers dressed in very fancy steel dresses, right?
Do you think we're on that path anyway because of the IRA
Yes.
and sort of
Yes.
trying to align ourselves with these
Yes.
supply chains?
So you look at that, and this is all about supply chains. It is all about improving the security of critical supply chains that the United States thinks is imperative for its national
For security, as you were saying
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah, I think that what the IRA was doing, similar to the tariffs that the national security actions, particularly in the first Trump administration, these were kind of blocking Canada as much as anything. I mean, the IRA, Canada is in on the battery consumer tax credit, but it's out, of a lot of things, and it's drawing capital out of Canada. As we haven't been able to compete to the same level of subsidization. So we were kind of looking and saying, how can we avoid arbitrary measures or discriminatory measures against Canada? Where are the points where we could matter more and therefore have a better argument when CUSMA comes up and other things come forward? And people aren't irrational about this. President Trump did bring actions against steel, did bring actions against aluminum. When his Commerce Department recommended actions on uranium, he rejected those.
The way I read your paper is you're basically saying, look, America and Europe too are doing industrial policy, and we want to be a part of their planning, a part of their industrial policy. Would that be accurate?
It's more. I mean, you're right that we are in an age of industrial policy, and Canada's always had an industrial policy. Sometimes we talk about it, sometimes we don't, but we wouldn't be a country if we hadn't had an industrial policy of building railways, Louisa, right? It's an old story for us, but it's not only us now, it's everyone is now, all the developed world is now investing seriously in industrial policies. Our only partner, and building malls, regionalizing. Our only partner in this is the United States.
So our clock is ticking down, and I do want to talk security. So another plank of your paper is a major initiative in security, and interestingly, you pick the Arctic. And I want to give you 1 minute to explain why, and then I'm going to quote from my friend who thinks it's bananas.
Well, let me, just welcome Ambassador Kraft and Ambassador Giffen back to Canada. It's so wonderful to have the two of you with us. But Ambassador Kraft just came back from Riga, right? Just think about who's in NATO now. All the Arctic countries but one, Russia. So the Arctic, in a sense, is now a second front line for NATO. And when we look at our investments in the Arctic, it is not enough. Now, the United States has one icebreaker. We are now in the process of building 4, thank goodness. But Russia is outspending by, it depends what you measure and what you count by, up to 50% combined of all the other of all the NATO members. I'm glad, Cliff, that you said that Americans really like us, but you walk into the Pentagon or the State Department and they say, what are you doing in the Arctic? This is the single most important thing that you can do for us. And that's the broadening argument. We have our hands full, and anyway, we can't build infrastructure, either civilian or with our Indigenous partners, or defense infrastructure for you. You have to do it. They are looking at Canada right now with an undefended Arctic, frankly.
And we went down to Washington as part of our research, and we talked to people from both parties. And we had, I remember in one Republican conversation, somebody said, the 2% isn't your problem. We went, what? They said, your problem is you don't know what role you want to play in global security.
Well, that's...
And this was a role in which we could play and which we thought was sellable in Canada. Because I can remember, in the great cutting 1995 budget, the least popular spending items that Canada had were foreign aid and defense spending. People don't like spending money on that, but maybe they would accept it more if it was for the homeland, for our territory, for our Arctic.
But if we're going to make a major investment, and the government has said they're going to ramp up spending, not quite, I think, to the 2% so far.
But they're going to count Arctic spending as our 2%.
So if we do ramp up spending, why not focus it on the Indo-Pacific, or why not focus it on NATO's eastern flank?
Because we will make a much big, dollar for dollar, we will have a much bigger impact in what we spend in the Arctic. And the United States will count that spending as part of our 2% commitment. We will not have the same impact in the Indo-Pacific, and they won't count it.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, we're not saying there shouldn't be spending on expeditionary force like in Latvia. We're saying that incremental spending should go where we can have impact and kind of build brand. You know, we're kind of Me Tooism country. Let's add one aircraft. Let's add a frigate to, you know, to something. We're saying, let's stand out and take leadership in a part of the world that is becoming contestable, and that is our territory.
And that will, as the ice melts, we didn't say that, but as the ice melts, who has the largest Arctic research in the world, institute in the world? 200 researchers. Not Canada, not the United States, not even Russia, China, which is not an Arctic power.
So final question, we have a minute left. Both the energy and critical minerals plank of your proposal and the Arctic security plank obviously will have a major impact on Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so I'd just like to hear from you, how do you envision them playing a role in a Canada-US strategy?
So I think one of the underappreciated things is a very, very important change in the way Indigenous leaders are thinking about partnering with Canada. There is a lot of serious discussion about equity partners in which our Indigenous communities become equity partners, both in the investments we make in Canada, but particularly in the North. So if you think about our defense policy update, the minister has said they will be, the Department of Defense over the next 10 years will be building Arctic hubs, but it's not connected to infrastructure. It's not connected to civilian infrastructure, and there's no budget for it. We have to think about this in an entirely different way now. We're co-investing with our Indigenous partners in building the infrastructure in the Arctic, which will be environmentally friendly, which will improve the living conditions, the opportunities for our Indigenous partners, and will also meet the expectations of those other 7 Arctic powers who now see us, and no Canadian that I know really talks this way, you have to go out of the country, who see Canada as a frontline state in this conflict now, because we face Russia.
What I keep hearing is nothing about us from Indigenous leaders, Indigenous peoples, nothing about us without us.
That's right.
And none of these things can be done without Indigenous consent, and there's no Indigenous consent anymore without Indigenous ownership and equity as far as the resource projects go, and certainly total consent in the Arctic and an economic development element, social development elements. You know, this cannot be divorced from the aspirations and of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Ed, Janice, thank you so much. I can't wait to test these ideas with the ambassadors and then afterwards with my friend.
Thank you.